I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that stuff. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there say, well, he's divorced, you have to do his stuff. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money is. That the boss is your boss.
Now, this last part of the show is not going to be as long as I typically do things. And the reason for that is because we are going to be covering 13 epic mob backstories in the history of Las Vegas. A lot of people think that Bugsy Siegel was the innovator of everything, and he truly wasn't. And there's a lot of people we have to talk about, especially when it's 13 different sort of backstories that we're going to discuss. And the reason why I had to stop at a certain point is because once we get into number 4, Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters and Frank Rosenthal, now we're talking a lot of information. So I that's one of those things that I can't scrimp on. I can't give you just little details. It's got to be very point A to point B. And that's why I chose to stop here this week. But on Friday of this week, because today is Monday, we will have the second show of this. So you will 100% hear the rest of it. I think it's going to be a 2-part series. So like I said, this first part isn't very long, but a lot of that's just because there's just too much information, because I would have had to stop halfway through Hoffa, and people get lost when I do that. So I'd rather have it so that it's all congruent together. All right, so this is 13 epic mob backstories in the history of Las Vegas, Nevada. So a lot of people, when they think about Las Vegas, right, they think about the heyday of Vegas and the mob's control of Vegas and the skimming. However, Vegas was a thing way before people ever realized that. Bugsy Siegel got a lot of those accolades and gets those because of the Flamingo. But in 1946, guys were out there before Bugsy was trying to establish organized crime. And we are going to talk about Siegel a little bit because, you know, he either gets his due or people give him way too much due, right? Especially when it comes to the historical impact that Bugsy Siegel had on the West Coast. And one of the things that I think people forget is that Bugsy Siegel was sent out west for very specific reasons. And it's not just the pilfering of money that got him killed. And it was more of an exclamation point at the end of his sentence when he gets killed. And at the behest of the Mafia, Benny Siegel, really, his whole career began, he was whacking guys left and right. Didn't give a shit. The problem was, because Bugsy Siegel had killed so many fucking people, his life was actually in danger back in New York. And the mob had heard that people were making inroads into Vegas and the West Coast. And the mob wanted control of it all. And this is why Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was sent out there initially. He actually gets sent out to California to help Jack Dragna. And for those that have always wondered why Dragna didn't do certain things, this week you're going to find out why. So like I said, he gets sent out to California to help Jack Dragna. And Dragna at the time is the leader of the Los Angeles Mafia. And they wanted him out there to help Jack Dragna control all of the gambling rackets on a national level. And when he arrives, he almost in his own way, Bugsy Siegel, plants his own flag. And he does so by naming Mickey Cohen his underboss. Now, while Mickey Cohen really wasn't an underboss, I'm just giving him that title to show you that Siegel went out there and wasn't playing around. And he only does that name, but that's how we sort of adequate it. Mickey Cohen was his bulldog, his go-to guy to kill people, to bust heads, crack heads. Mickey Cohen was that guy. And the thing is that the mob didn't even really explain to Jack Dragna why Bugsy Siegel was even out there. But then they sent word that Jack Dragna was to cooperate with whatever Bugsy Siegel was doing, or else there would be a problem. I believe it was Luciano who sent word from prison saying, this is our guy out here in the West. If you have any problems, just go along with whatever he says, because if you don't, we're going to kill you. I mean, that's basically the end of it. And it more or less meant that Jack Dragna no longer had any say in anything that happened out west, and that he had become subservient to the Jewish mob. The Jewish mob out there was looked at as more of an equal to the Italians than Jack Dragna was. Now, we have never really on this show gotten into the why, but I think the answer has always been there, sort of right in front of us. I think the mob wanted control of Hollywood, the unions, and everything. And I think that Jack Dragna just didn't have the ability or the desire to conquer. Some of the mob's early bosses were like Caesar and like Mark Antony. But Dragna was a bit of a pushover. Sure, I mean, he had common rackets that we see in organized crime, but he was not truly tapping the oil well. And the mob saw this likely as a weakness, which is why Siegel was sent out there to begin with. In fact, Luciano, like I said, sent word from prison to Dragna that he was to fully cooperate or else. And within months of arriving, Siegel takes the numbers rackets and makes them profitable. The other facet as to why Siegel was out there was because the Mafia was establishing drug trade routes through Mexico, and Bugsy Siegel was helping put that together. As well, we know about the Racing Wire, which was a national service where people could bet on the ponies and more. And it was like taking McDonald's in its infancy as one store in Mississippi and making it national. And by 1942, Bugsy Siegel was pulling in $500,000 a day. And if we look at that just for reference, we go 500 times 30, which is $15 million a month, $180 million a year. That's in 1942, just off the Racing Wire, the money he's pulling in. And that's close to $3 billion a year. That's fucking insane. Just blows my mind, the amount of money. And when you have a guy who's in charge of so much and he's stealing on top of it, I mean, that's a huge fucking issue. However, in 1946, Chicago kind of makes a move against Bugsy Siegel. And what they do is they take over the Racing Wire and they kick back 10% to Dragna. And the move infuriated Siegel, which is likely why he begins to pilfer down the road. And you heard that right. Chicago made a move and wanted Siegel not controlling the Racing Wire. They didn't want him controlling it. So they said, okay, well, we're going to give the cut of the proceeds back to Jack Dragna, which I can only imagine how irate Bugsy Siegel was. And that's why Siegel starts to steal down the line, because he knows he's getting fucked out of money. And eventually, Bugsy Siegel names himself boss of California. And the mob pretty much ignored it. Yeah, let him say whatever. And they only did that because Siegel was bringing in $3 billion a year. And eventually the Racing Wire issues get settled, and there's cooler temperatures with that. And then in 1946, he rips off Wilkerson and takes over the Flamingo. And we know what happens there. And so the idea that Bugsy just stole money is a large part of the wheel as to why. And this is why Lansky had no legs to stand on when he argued that Siegel was a good guy at the end of the day. And so there was a lot to Bugsy Siegel, and maybe he should be noted as a historical figure in Vegas, but the truth is, Vegas crime rackets were already established out west, but not by those you would think. Siegel just knew how to infiltrate, absorb, and push. Number one, we got to go back to 1925 to Big Jim Ferguson. He was established out west way before the Mafia ever was. Initially, gambling in Las Vegas was legal, then banned in 1909, and then legal again in 1931. Ferguson was nicknamed the King of the Tenderloin. And he was really the powerhouse out west. He was a no-nonsense, violent, politically connected gangster. And not much is known about his early days. But we know that in 1924, at age 31, he arrived in Ely, Nevada. Ferguson was a racketeer, and with the town of Ely being filled with nothing but men and copper mines, he knew how to corner the market on prostitution. He meets Vera Magnus, who at the time had designs on opening her own brothel, and she needed the cash to do it, and Ferguson was the guy that could provide that. Eventually they would get married, but Ely, the little town of Ely, was just too small. And so what they did was they ended up getting married, which was probably more of a business arrangement, and then he ends up going to Las Vegas. And when they arrive in Vegas, they found that gambling and bootlegging and prostitution were in full swing. And through conversations, Ferguson finds out that the illicit rackets were secretly being run by city officials and minor criminals for the last 20 years. Local law enforcement was bought and paid for by these criminals, and they only chased out new criminals. And as the city began to cry foul over the crimes going on, election would go down where two men, William German and Fred Hess, were poised to take over as mayors. But both the mayoral candidacy and the city council seats are on the ballot. Both men promised to eradicate crime, illegal liquor, and more. And with elections coming, Ferguson made his move. He knew the red light district could be taken by force, but Al James was going to be his biggest problem. James had been in control of the rackets in the red light district for more than 20 years in Vegas. And the district was ripe for war, and that's what Ferguson was about to ignite. Ferguson would send his own men to the Arizona Club, which is where James's base of operations was. And it was the biggest bar and gamble den in Las Vegas. Ferguson's men entered the club and piped and baseball batted anybody who got near him. And if you think Ferguson wasn't involved in that, you'd be wrong. He was the first through the fucking door. He was not one not to get involved. And after the melee and assaults, Ferguson would be arrested and charged. He would eventually be convicted and would be sent to jail for 4 months for cracking heads. Eventually, Ferguson's power became too much and James had to step aside. And even though James still owned the Arizona club, Ferguson controlled the saloon part of the club. And what helped Ferguson more than anything was two things. Number one, Fred Hess, who was up for election, backed Ferguson silently, and he kept things quiet. And the new city marshal, which effectively was basically the chief of police, was Robert Lake. And in 1924, when he gets out of jail, Ferguson took over control of the bootlegging rackets in Vegas. Ferguson, with the help of Hess and Lake, controlled the market in Vegas. The city maneuvered to make it look legitimate, like instituting small fines to Ferguson to make it appear as if the city wasn't allowing it, but rather they're fining him for his actions. And it was just a way for them to accept kickbacks more than anything to allow Ferguson to operate. Ferguson then institutes a protection racket against the city's other bootleggers. And he knows that if he goes to war, the carnage is going to be so widespread, and what he does is pretty interesting. What he ends up doing is he charges all bootleggers protection money in return for keeping their operations open and limited arrests and fines by the city. As well, all liquor needed to be purchased from Ferguson stills. And Ferguson would then expand his operations and then established basically every prostitution racket in the city. And he also expanded his booze operation into Southern California, Utah, and elsewhere in Nevada. In 1928, raids would take place on Ferguson's businesses, but Hess stepped in and helped control that issue. It was a small setback, but Ferguson remained in control. Further, in 1928, an 8-year-old boy was shot and killed. The issue was that the child was the son of Charlie Bradshaw, who was a bootlegger in the city. Bradshaw had refused to pay Ferguson his protection fees and suddenly was shot at, and his son was killed. And what had happened was cops had attempted to pull over Bradshaw as he sped away, and cops fired shots trying to hit the tires to blow them out. But a bullet struck his son, killing him in the back seat, and it was all too much. And Dietrich, who was the shooter and a cop, and Lake would be charged with conspiracy to murder, which would lead to Ferguson being arrested as well. Because of the shooting and the friendly politicians that Ferguson depended on, he couldn't bury that. Ferguson would soon be charged at the federal level of bootlegging. So Bradshaw, enraged it would happen to his son, and I don't think anybody could blame him, began cooperating with authorities and giving them dirt on all of Ferguson's operations. With that info, the feds then raid Ferguson's businesses. It was the biggest raid in Las Vegas's history. And as the trial began, Bradshaw would state that he initially paid Ferguson $50 a month for 6 months and then stopped. Then all of a sudden he was being harassed nonstop by the cops, pulled over every other day, and arrested every other week. Eventually cases would be dropped against Hess, and Ferguson would be found guilty and sentenced to 1 year and a handful of days in prison. And Ferguson would walk out of the joint after 40 days. And by the time Ferguson gets out, he finds that his little town had been absorbed by Southern California gangsters. Ferguson would have more arrests, more problems, and it eventually gave way for him to head to Utah. He would eventually form a safe cracking crew and begin to exploit Utah. He'd eventually get caught, plead out, and do another year. When he was released, he then takes off to Washington State. Within a few weeks, gets arrested for vagrancy. And that was a sign that Washington State did not want him there. He would eventually head back to Vegas, collect his troops. But the feds were watching everything that he was doing. I mean everything. The feds and the locals thought he was responsible for a crime spree that went on between Lincoln County and southern Utah. Eventually, he'd be arrested again. And he would do 3 years. And that's where his story suddenly just ends. Nobody knows what happened to him after that. Number 2, Guy McAfee. So you might not have heard of Guy, but he was no joke either. He was a former head of the LAPD Vice Squad. At the same time that he was the head of the Vice Squad, he was also a gangster on the low. Turns out his wife was a Hollywood madam, and that money that they were making from the prostitution on the low helped him open underground gambling dens in California and Vegas. Because of his status in the LAPD, he knew about all the raids coming and going and control his empire without any interruptions. McAfee expanded into narcotics as well. However, in the 1930s, a new mayor was elected by the name of Fletcher Boron. He demanded that the city clean up its bad cops and immediately began going after anybody who he suspected was involved in organized crime. McAfee's operation was exploited, and under pressure, McAfee quit his job with the LAPD and leaves town. And there was probably a deal offered, get lost and we'll leave this alone, and McAfee agreed. But guess where he goes? Las Vegas. He arrives in 1938 and buys the Dice Dice Club, renaming it the 91 Club, which would later become the Frontier Hotel and Casino. In 1946, he builds the Golden Nugget. McAfee was sort of the guy behind the Strip idea. Nobody had ever called it the Strip. He was the first guy that sort of gave it that sort of moniker. McAfee, once in Vegas, opens club after club after club, underground gambling for Hollywood's biggest celebrities and more. And he would end up controlling Fremont Street, and the 91 Club was the destination that people flocked to. In 1940, McAfee turns his attention downtown, which already had a number of established casinos. He started the Frontier Club, a small casino at his Fremont Street property. Next door, McAfee built the Mandalay Lounge nightclub with a South Seas theme and a storm-weathered wooden dock-like facade and bamboo rails leading up a ramp to the entrance. McAfee's Mandalay served as tropical drinks and had an interior feature unique to the town, especially for 1940, a simulated tropical storm with raindrops falling amid faux lighting and thunder that patrons could watch from the booths in a 45-foot bar. In April of 1941, at the Strip's first resort, the El Rancho Vegas, was opened a mile north of the 91 Club on Highway 91. Later that year, R.E. Griffith, a movie theater chain owner from Texas, arrived in Las Vegas with his nephew, William J. Bill Moore. Griffith wanted McAfee's Strip property for a resort to compete with the El Rancho. McAfee sold the 91 Club and its adjacent auto park to Griffith for $35,000, about $15,000 more than he paid for the Paradise. Griffith and Moore soon converted McAfee's club into a large bar called the Carrillo Room and debuted on the Strip's second resort, the Last Frontier, in 1942. That year, McAfee bought the Pioneer Club on Fremont. In 1945, he acquired the SS Rex, later renamed Benny Binion's Horseshoe. Still known in Hollywood, McAfee convinced film idols such as William Powell and Cary Grant to come to Las Vegas to see his casinos. McAfee would then embark on a major downtown project in 1945. He took over from a former coffee shop and pool hall at 125 Fremont Street to make room for a casino he dubbed the Golden Nugget Saloon. For added space, he acquired the Old Boulder drugstore around the corner on First Street. With $250 to spend, he planned to decorate the saloon and casino with items at least 50 years old except for the neon. He ordered Victorian-era woodwork, imported Italian marble, and a 120-ton air conditioning system. In 1946, McAfee opened the Golden Nugget with a decor based on the 19th century Barbary Coast in San Francisco. It was the finest gaming hall downtown in the area, nicknamed the Glitter Gulch. The Golden Nuggets Casino was the largest in Las Vegas at the time. In 1949, McAfee built a 100-foot neon sign that proclaimed the Golden Nugget the brightest night spot in the world. In 1951, McAfee and his two partners in the Golden Nugget, Jake Kozloff and Belden Kettleman, bought the Last Frontier on the growing Strip for $5.5 million. The resort by then included an outdoor Old West-style attraction, the Last Frontier Village, and the Silver Slipper nightclub and casino. McAfee and Kozloff renamed the resort the Frontier. They would then sell it to L.A. businessman Maurice Friedman and Irv Leff and their partners in 1955. McAfee would die in 1960 at age 71. So McAfee gets his whole entire start being the head of the LAPD Vice Squad and a gangster on the side. All right, number 3, Mo Dalitz arrives. And we've talked about Mo Dalitz. And, I'm not going to go into complete biographical sort of information, but here's some information. Mo Dalitz was born in Boston. He gets into full swing in organized crime by 1919. His family owned a laundry truck business, and one of Dalitz's really unique thought processes early on was, I'm going to use our own family-run laundry trucks for bootlegging. And genius idea, smart thing to do, and that's how he started. He would form close bonds with the Maceo crime family in Galveston, Texas, and was pushing booze into Canada and Mexico. And as Prohibition ends, he moves right into gambling and extortion, specifically the Steubenville, Ohio, and Covington, Kentucky areas. And Dalitz was as we know, at the infamous Atlantic City Conference, and it was alleged at this meeting that Dalitz asked for protection from the Purple Gang in Detroit to keep his competition at bay. And the Purple Gang, which was the Jewish mob in Detroit, offered a solution. They wanted Dalitz to move his operations to Ohio, and this is why he ends up in Cleveland and ends up taking over bootlegging and operations there, using his money to buy legitimate businesses. After a stint in the military and after the war, Dalitz is one of several men invited to New York City for a meeting of the minds. The mob was looking for investors out west to run businesses, mainly California and Vegas, and Dalitz was all in. He quickly built golf courses and used his power to grab a $1 million loan from the Teamsters Pension Fund. He then builds and opens the Desert Inn, the Stardust, and the Showboat. And while he was the front, the skim began. Dalitz would then become the mob's point man in Las Vegas for skimming and more. Dalitz's power within the city helped mobsters like Raymond Patriarca and Carlo Gambino have very horribly unhidden shares in casinos like the Sands, which were fronts in name by Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Dalitz also becomes the point man to Chicago, Santo Trafficante, and Carlos Marcello. Dalitz, who was at best a gangster, was responsible for making Vegas appear to be clean and a place where families could live. All his philanthropic deeds were merely simply fronts to make the mafia money and keep himself out of jail. And you have to think about it this way. Dalitz never gets hammered by the feds or anybody. He was able to survive all of that, excuse me, because he kept himself insulated better than anybody else out in Vegas. Think about it. Did we ever hear Morris Dalitz get called to any Hoffa hearings? No. Because I think, and listen, I could be wrong. If he'd have been Italian, it might have been different. Maybe not. But if everybody knows he's the guy out in Vegas, why is it nobody's like pestering him? You know what I mean? Like they went after, we understand why he went after Spilotro, but Rosenthal, for example, it's just, it's one of those things, but Mo Dalitz was behind a lot of shit. He really was. So when we come back next week, we are going to be at number 4, Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters and Frank Lefty Rosenthal. So like I said, it was going to be a short one this week. When we come back next week, not next week, this week, it'll be part 2 of Vegas. Enjoy the show. Have a great week. We'll see all of you 100% probably Thursday is when the next one will be released. Take it easy, everybody.